Are tanks dead? American Abrams tanks are being pulled off the front line in Ukraine because they are too vulnerable to cheap Russian drones. Is this, as some suggest, the final death knell of the main battle tank? I'm Jerome Starkey, and this is World at War. My guest today is General Sir Richard Barrons, one of Britain's foremost military minds and a former Joint Chief of Britain's Armed Forces. General Barrons, thank you for joining us today. Are tanks dead? Have they got a future?
Yeah, of course, tanks are not dead. If you're on a battlefield and people are dropping bombs on you, firing artillery at you, using machine guns and mines, you're going to want an armoured vehicle. You're going to want an armoured vehicle with tracks on it so you can travel across country without any inhibitions. And you're going to want to take a big gun and some very effective sights with you into the fight. But the tanks are going to change because they are at risk from drones. So we're going to see an evolution of armoured vehicles. And very soon they will turn up with counter-drone capability on them. And it'll all be more in balance again.
So this technology leapfrogging itself. I mean, I would not want to be in a tank in Ukraine at the moment. I mean, the number of videos we've seen of these FPV drones seeking them out, dropping through the turrets or hitting them in the tracks, destroying them. They appear incredibly vulnerable at the moment.
Well, tanks have always been vulnerable to people who can get close to them in the air or on the ground. So what we need to see is an evolution of equipment and tactics. So we need to talk about the orchestra of war, a fusion of what the tank can do, but also infantry and artillery and other sorts of capability in the air. And it's the blend of those things that makes you effective on the battlefield. And when we talk about first-person view drones, yes, they're having a significant effect. In some cases, that's because Ukraine hasn't got enough artillery ammunition. And in other cases, it's a shortfall in tactics. But roughly speaking, only 1 in 10 drones makes it through the electronic interference that it has to find its path through. And that means they're not as effective as they sometimes appear.
I spent some time with the Challenger Squadron in Ukraine. So I think we donated 14 and a handful being used for training. But it was really interesting. I went there expecting to hear stories about how amazing these tanks had been. We hear so much about how formidable the Challenger tank is, and you know what it can achieve. But actually, it was a much more nuanced picture. They were saying that they felt the tank was underpowered. It kept on getting stuck in the terrain. In fact, when I was with it, it got stuck. One of the tanks I was with got stuck in the mud and they had to pull up another one and drag it out. I mean, is that a Challenger problem? Is that a tank problem? Is that terrain in Ukraine? I mean, what's going on?
So the UK gave Ukraine 14 Challenger 2 tanks. This is 1990s vintage equipment. And the crews that Ukraine have trained on those tanks are inexperienced. And I would say that a much more experienced UK crew would be savvier about where they drove, how they got there, and how they fought the tank. So there's bound to be an experience deficit. But the fact is, the Challenger 2 is an old tank, and therefore it is going to struggle against some modern equipment.
But there aren't new tanks. I mean, the Leopard 2 is an old tank. The Abrams is an old tank. I mean, it appears perhaps only it's the Armata, the Russian Armata, but they're not really bringing that into battle. I mean, this is a war of old tanks fighting old tanks.
Yes, it is. But there are new tanks. So the UK is buying the Challenger 3, so that'll be more powerful. It'll have a different and better gun and uprated armour and other systems that will protect it against drones. So we should recognise the tank is in a state of evolution. But the key point for me here is you can't just give someone a tank. It's a really complicated machine and expect them to be brilliant with it. They have got to learn and be trained and get experience, and that's going to take a season or two.
One of the messages that came through in Ukraine was that NATO tanks are tank-killing tanks. They're designed to shoot and destroy other tanks, whereas the soldiers who were using them, the Ukrainians, had grown up on Soviet-era equipment. They'd grown up on T-72s, T-80s. Those tanks were used differently. Is that your understanding of the sort of doctrines? Is there a difference?
So if you go back to the Cold War, which finished in 1989, the heart of the land battle there was a battle between tanks, between the Challenger 2 and the T-72 and the T-90. That dominated the battlefield. Things are different now for two big reasons. The one is the battlefield has become transparent from the sky and from other sources of data. So you can't move a tank at night and hope not to be spotted or hide it in a wood. It's much more difficult. But more than that, the advent of precision weapons from the sky and from the ground means that if you can see a tank, you can kill it at really large ranges. So it's finding a different place in this orchestra of war. But I come back to the point I made at the start. On a battlefield full of shrapnel and bullets, you are going to need an armoured vehicle and you're going to want a big gun.
Have you noticed them playing a significant role in the Israel-Gaza campaign? I mean, we have seen tanks there, but again, different threat picture, and yet they don't appear to have been a sort of defining weapon of the conflict. So
in a scenario like Gaza, you'd expect the tank to be used differently. It's clearly not going to find Hamas tanks to fire at, but it's a really good way of dominating particularly open ground. It's not a good thing to fight in an urban area unless you are really sure that the enemy is kept some distance away from you. But if you need to knock a building down, then you'll use a tank.
And in terms of the evolution of where these weapons are going, you mentioned that Britain's upgrading its fleet to Challenger 3s, but at the same time it's going down from 227, 28 I think, down to about 150, just under 150. Is the increase in capability that these tanks are going to compensate for the fact we're going to have 80 fewer of them?
Absolutely not, in one key regard, which is most European armed forces, the UK included, have the armies that they ended up with at the end of about 30 years of post-Cold War decline and hollowing out. So right now we have the army the post-Cold War era left us with when we need an army fit for the pre-war world that our own government says that we need to face up to. So we're going to need bigger and more effective armies. However, there is one huge play coming, which is right now, most of our tanks, or all of our tanks, are crewed by people. But what's coming is a mix of tanks crewed by people and autonomous tanks that follow them and are effectively their loyal wingmen, just as we see in the sky. And this advent of autonomous capability, like tanks and artillery and infantry vehicles, is going to be a different way of making armies bigger and more effective.
So this is robo-tanks?
This is robo-tanks.
And how quickly are they going to come in?
These vehicles already exist. For example, there's a South Korean firm called Hanwha that makes a really good 155mm self-propelled artillery gun. About 3 years from now, you can buy one with a crew on it and two that just follow it around with no people on it at all. That's where this is going.
And it's going to look like a tank, it's going to sound like a tank. I mean,
Well, there'll be a big difference in that if you make a vehicle that's never going to have people in it, you're not going to give it seats and the space for a human to maneuver, and you may even protect it differently. So I'd expect them to be lower, faster, cheaper. And of course, if it's a machine, it doesn't need to train like a human. So they'll be cheaper to buy, cheaper to operate. You won't care if you lose them. So it's the whole new recipe in what is part of the biggest transformation of how you make an army, navy and air force for about 150 years.
Why has it taken so long? Why hasn't it happened already? I mean, the technology exists. We've seen it with the drones. You mentioned Hanwha making it an autonomous self-propelled gun. Why do you think this hasn't happened already with tanks?
Well, it's not happened because the urgency, the necessity, this is an expensive thing, perhaps wasn't there before the war in Ukraine. But actually what we're seeing here is the application of technology that's being developed in the civil sector. So autonomous cars from Google and many other people are producing the technology at tens of billions of dollars that will then be applied into the military arena. So to some degree, you've got to wait for the civil sector to crack it and then pass it across to the military. It's the absolute reverse of innovation in the Second World War.
General Sir Richard Barrons, tanks are not dead, but perhaps tanks as we know them might be. The future robo-tanks, autonomous tanks driven by Google and self-driving cars. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Jerome Starkey and this is World at War. If you're watching on YouTube and you have any questions, please ask them in the comments below and we will do our best to answer them next week.